Imagine being a single mom, struggling to make ends meet, when your landlord, who's supposed to help provide a safe home, kicks you out without mercy. What happens next will shock you. Karma has a way of teaching the hardest lessons. Stick around to see how this powerful story unfolds and how one man's cruelty meets a twist of fate he'll never forget. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to stay updated on more dramatic real-life stories. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, tucked away from the hustle and bustle of the city, Sarah lived in a modest apartment with her young son, Liam. Life wasn't easy for her. She worked long hours at a local diner, always exhausted but never complaining. Every penny she earned went to bills, groceries, and making sure Liam had everything he needed. Despite the challenges, Sarah kept a smile on her face, determined to give her son a better life, even if it meant sacrificing her own comfort. However, there was one thing Sarah couldn't escape: the cruel and insensitive man who owned the building she called home, Mr. Harris. He seemed to take pleasure in making life harder for his tenants, constantly raising the rent with little notice. It didn't matter if someone was struggling. His only concern was making as much money as possible. He was always looking for a reason to kick someone out, showing no empathy for the families who lived there. To him, they were just numbers on a lease, and he never cared about the personal stories behind the faces he saw every day. But little did he know his actions were about to have a consequence he could never have imagined. Sarah's life was a constant balancing act. Each day felt like a marathon, as she tried to juggle her demanding job, caring for Liam, and managing the growing pile of bills. Her job at the diner barely paid enough to cover their needs, and despite her best efforts, Sarah had fallen behind on the rent. The unexpected medical expenses for Liam's doctor visits had drained what little savings she had left. Liam had been sick for weeks, and his health became a constant worry hanging over Sarah's head. The sleepless nights and endless days seemed to blur together as she struggled to keep everything afloat. But through it all, Sarah never let her son see how difficult things were. She smiled through the exhaustion, did her best to keep Liam happy, and made sure he never felt the weight of their struggles. She'd tell him everything was okay, even when she didn't feel like it was. She wanted to protect him from the harsh realities of their situation. One day, desperate for a solution, Sarah made the hard decision to go to Mr. Harris. She explained her situation, her son's illness, and asked for a little more time to pay the rent. She wasn't asking for charity, just a few extra weeks. But Mr. Harris showed no compassion. He listened coldly, his face unreadable, before delivering his cruel response. "I don't care about your personal life," he said, his voice flat and indifferent. "If you don't pay up now, you're out." Sarah's heart sank. She had nowhere to turn. Mr. Harris wasted no time in delivering the final blow. With a cold, calculated tone, he handed Sarah an ultimatum: pay the rent or be out by the end of the month. His words cut through her like a knife. Her heart sank as she realized just how desperate her situation had become. The tears she had been holding back for so long threatened to spill, but she pushed them down. There was no room for weakness, not now. Determined not to let her son suffer, Sarah worked harder than ever. She picked up extra shifts at the diner, working long hours into the night. Her body ached from exhaustion, but she didn't care. She even sold some of her personal belongings, her treasured old jewelry, a few of her clothes, and a couple of items that had sentimental value. Anything to scrape together enough to pay the rent. But as the days passed, it became painfully clear: no matter how hard she tried, the money just wasn't enough. The deadline was fast approaching. Sarah, barely able to keep her eyes open from the exhaustion, walked into Mr. Harris's office again. She was hoping for even a small bit of mercy, but he wasn't interested in listening to her story anymore. Without a second glance, he handed her an eviction notice. "No excuses," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You didn't come up with the money, and now you're out." He seemed to take pleasure in her pain, mocking her desperation as she stood there, powerless. Sarah felt the weight of the world pressing down on her. She had done everything she could, everything she knew how to do, and it still wasn't enough. The reality of her situation crushed her. She left his office, feeling utterly defeated, yet still clinging to the sliver of hope that something might change. But when she got home, alone in the quiet apartment, The tears she had been holding back finally broke free. She sat on the edge of the couch, her hands shaking as she tried to hold it together for Liam, but the exhaustion, the fear and the sense of hopelessness were overwhelming. How was she going to make it through this? How would she tell her son that they were about to lose everything? Just when Sarah thought things couldn't get worse, a small envelope arrived in the mail. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw the return address, a charity that helped struggling families. She tore open the envelope, and inside was a check for a one-time assistance grant to help cover her rent. It was a lifeline. The charity had heard about her situation, and they had stepped in to help. The check wasn't enough to pay the entire rent, but it was a significant amount, a sum that could give her the extra time she needed to gather the rest. For the first time in days, Sarah allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. She rushed over to Mr. Harris's office, clutching the check in her hand. Maybe, just maybe, this would be enough to change his mind. She could finally breathe again. She entered his office, her heart racing as she handed him the check. "Please," she pleaded. "This is all I have right now. Just a little more time, and I'll get the rest." But Mr. Harris, without even looking at the check, waved it away with a dismissive gesture. "It's too small," he said, barely glancing. "I've already made up my mind. You're out." His words were sharp and cold, as if he took pleasure in crushing her hope. "This isn't my problem. I don't care how you got it, or what your situation is. Rent is due, and you haven't paid. That's all that matters." Sarah felt the floor drop beneath her. Her last chance to save her home had been crushed just like that. Her heart shattered, but she refused to let him see her tears. She turned and left, her mind racing for any other option, any way to avoid being evicted. Back in her apartment, Sarah tried to hold it together, but the desperation was overwhelming. She needed a place for her and Liam to stay. Something affordable, something safe. But rents in the area were through the roof. She couldn't even afford a deposit for a new place. Every door she tried to open seemed to slam shut in her face. As the days went by, she sank deeper into despair. She called every affordable housing provider she could find, but there were no openings. The thought of losing her home, and worse, having nowhere to go with Liam, kept her awake at night. She started to think that there really was no way out. Just when she was about to give up completely, her phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number.
President.
She picked up the call. "Hello?" she said, her voice shaky.
Is this Sarah?
A woman's voice asked. "Yes? Who is this?" The woman introduced herself as someone from the property management company of a new building in the area. She explained that there had been a mix-up with an apartment application, and due to unforeseen circumstances, they had a vacancy available. The rent was affordable, and they were willing to work with Sarah on the deposit. Sarah's heart leaped in her chest. Was this a dream? Could it be real? She thanked the woman profusely, her voice filled with disbelief. In that moment, Sarah realized that even when it seemed like there was no way out, the universe had a way of stepping in when you least expect it. A new beginning was just around the corner, one she desperately needed to hold on to for herself and leave. After Sarah left Mr. Harris's office, a wave of despair washed over her. She had given everything she could, and still he showed no mercy. But slowly, as the hours passed, that despair began to shift into something else. Anger. She had worked so hard for everything she had, and here was this man treating her like she was worthless, pushing her out of her home, just because she couldn't meet his inflated demands. The injustice of it burned deep inside her.
Meanwhile,
Mr. Harris's world was starting to unravel. His cruelty towards his tenants had caught up with him. He'd always been focused on squeezing as much money out of them as possible, but now his greed was starting to backfire. Word had spread about his harsh treatment of tenants, and they began leaving in droves. The building, once full, now stood half empty. No one wanted to live under his thumb anymore. His reputation had soured. On top of that, his business was in trouble. His debts were mounting, and he was struggling to keep up with the bills. The more tenants he lost, the more pressure piled on him. Eventually, he had no choice but to sell the business. Even this wasn't a relief. The new buyers, ruthless and cold, saw an opportunity to capitalize on the situation. and decided to increase the rent across the entire building. For the remaining tenants, the nightmare of Mr. Harris's rule was far from over. As if the universe had a way of balancing sense, Sarah's situation began to turn around. Her son Liam had made a remarkable recovery. His health was improving, and the constant worry that had clouded Sarah's every moment began to lift. To make things even better, Sarah received a call about a new job opportunity, one that offered better pay and benefits than her current job. For the first time in months, Sarah felt like things might actually get better. She could breathe a little easier, knowing that the future was starting to look brighter for her and Liam. But fate wasn't done with Mr. Harris yet. Just as Sarah was starting to build a new life for herself and Liam, she received unexpected news. The building she had once feared losing had been sold. At first, she felt a flutter of worry. What if the new owners were just as cruel as Mr. Harris? But as soon as she learned who they were, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. The new owners were nothing like Mr. Harris. They were kind and understanding, with a refreshing perspective on what it meant to be a landlord. Unlike Mr. Harris, they didn't view their tenants as nothing more than sources of income. They saw them as people, hardworking individuals and families, doing their best to make a living. They valued their tenants and wanted to make sure they felt at home. The first thing they did was reverse the outrageous rent hikes that Mr. Harris had imposed. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything to Sarah and the others who had been living with constant fear of eviction. For the first time in a long while, Sarah no longer had to spend sleepless nights worrying that she could be kicked out at any moment. There was finally some peace, some security. The change in ownership marked a turning point not just for Sarah, but for everyone in the building. The new owners didn't waste any time fixing the problems Mr. Harris had ignored for years. They began repairing the long-neglected maintenance issues, making sure the building was safe and comfortable for everyone. For Sarah and her neighbors, it was like a weight had been lifted. They no longer had to live in a state of constant anxiety. They could finally relax, knowing they were safe, knowing they could keep their homes. And as for Mr. Harris, his world was unraveling in ways he never expected. His empire, built on greed and cruelty, was crumbling before his eyes. The financial troubles he had so long ignored grew worse by the day. The property he had once treated as his personal gold mine had been snatched away from him, sold to the new owners, who had no interest in continuing his oppressive ways. The same ruthless drive for money that had once made him feel invincible was now the very thing that brought him down. Karma had come for him, and there was no escape. The cold, heartless actions he had taken to ruin the lives of so many had come back to haunt him. The tenants he had tormented had moved on, found peace, and begun new chapters in their lives, while he was left to face the consequences of his own choices. He would never forget the pain he had caused, nor would he forget the lesson he learned too late, that the cruelty you put into the world always finds its way back to you. In the end, Mr. Harris was forced to confront the reality of his own actions, the cruel choices he made, and the greed that had driven him for so long. The power he had once wielded over his tenants, the control he thought he held over their lives, slipped through his fingers like sand. Every harsh word, every unfair demand, and every act of cruelty he had inflicted on people like Sarah had led him to this inevitable point. He found himself standing at the edge of a financial abyss, penniless and struggling, with no one left to turn to. The building that had once been his empire, a tool he used to manipulate others, was now beyond his reach. It was sold to new owners, leaving him with nothing. His fate was sealed, and it was his own greed and lack of compassion that had led him here. The tenants he had once looked down on, who had feared his threats and oppressive rules, were free from his reign. They were no longer at his mercy, and that was a bitter pill for him to swallow. On the other hand, Sarah's life had taken a turn for the better. She no longer had to live with the constant threat of eviction hanging over her head. Her son Liam had made remarkable progress with his health, and The weight of her constant worry about him seemed to lift. The new job offer she had received brought with it the hope she so desperately needed. It wasn't just a paycheck, it was a lifeline, a sign that things could finally change for the better. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah could breathe easier. She wasn't just surviving, she was starting to live again. With Liam's health improving and a more stable future ahead, Sarah could now focus on what truly mattered, building a life filled with love, stability, and opportunity for her son. She no longer had to sacrifice her well-being to scrape by, and the future no longer felt like an endless struggle. Sarah's perseverance had finally paid off. The countless sleepless nights, the exhaustion from working multiple jobs, the constant juggling of responsibilities, it had all been worth it. Through it all, she had maintained her strength and determination, refusing to give up. Now she had a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She could give Liam a better life, one where he could grow up free from the fear and uncertainty that Sarah had found her strength, and in doing so, she had created a future full of hope. The story ends with a powerful message of hope. No matter how hard life gets, kindness, patience, and perseverance can lead to better days. And for those who choose to hurt others, karma will always find a way to teach them the lesson they need to learn. The universe has a way of making things right, even when it feels like all hope is lost. Thank you for watching Sarah's story. Her journey of strength, determination, and the ultimate lesson that karma always finds a way to balance things out. It's a powerful reminder that no matter how difficult life gets, staying kind, persistent, and true to yourself can lead to a brighter future. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with others who need to hear this message of hope. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on more inspiring stories like this one. Your support means the world, and we can't wait to share more with you.